Welcome back to episode 10 of our Explainer series. Today, we're diving straight in to unpack how one massive offensive became one of history's most infamous clashes, the Battle of the Somme. It's a name that really echoes through history, right? It's almost become this shorthand for the absolute tragedy and apparent futility of World War I trench warfare. But we're going to explore a really crucial question today. How did a meticulously planned operation, something designed to be this grand, decisive breakthrough, turn into such a brutal grinding down of two massive armies? We're going to explore the massive gap between what military commanders expected to happen and the horrific reality that actually unfolded on the ground. To kick things off, try wrapping your head around this number, 1,260,000. That's the estimated number of combined casualties, meaning men killed, wounded, or captured, over the course of this single battle. To put a figure like that into perspective, that is basically the capacity of modern-day Wembley Stadium filled to the brim 14 times over. It really sets the tragic stakes for what we're looking at today. How do we even begin to comprehend a battle that yields over 1 million casualties? Section 1. The plan to relieve Verdun. To understand the disaster, we really have to look at the grand strategy and why the Somme happened exactly when and where it did. Actually, the area wasn't chosen for any brilliant tactical advantage. It was all about geography. Originally, the British and French, led by Sir Douglas Haig and Marshal Joseph Joffre, wanted this combined decisive push. But earlier in 1916, the Germans launched an absolute hammer blow against the French at Verdun. The French were essentially being bled dry trying to defend their historic forts. Because of that desperate situation, the French just couldn't lead the Somme offensive anymore. The British had to step up. They had to launch this massive diversion simply to draw German troops away and prevent a total French collapse. Section 2. The 7-day bombardment. The entire British expectation for this attack relied heavily on an unprecedented, earth-shattering preliminary barrage. The plan was methodical, really leaning on the raw industrial might of the British Empire. Commanders were so supremely confident in their artillery that they believed the enemy defenses would be totally obliterated. Just listen to this chilling quote from the planning stages. They genuinely thought not even a rat would be left alive in the German trenches. The expectation was that the infantry would literally just walk across no man's land, casually occupy destroyed enemy positions, and then they'd send in a second wave of cavalry to sweep through the gap. The scale of this preparation was almost unimaginable. We're talking mountains of munitions. The British fired over 1.5 million shells over a relentless 7-day period. Just think about that volume for a second. The bombardment was so incredibly dense and so loud that the booming of the guns could actually be heard on Hampstead Heath in London. That is 165 miles away from the front line. They were absolutely certain that nothing could survive that firestorm. Section 3. The bloodiest first 10. But when the guns finally lifted on the morning of July 1st, 1916, the tragic reality revealed itself in a devastating way. 57,470. That's the number of casualties the British Army suffered on the very first day of the attack alone. To this day, July 1st, 1916, remains the bloodiest single day in the entire history of the British Army. Almost 20,000 of those men were killed. The expectation of a quiet stroll across the battlefield completely shattered the second those men climbed over the top of their trenches. This contemporary quote from John Butchin paints a vivid, really terrible picture of what happened. Allied forces, largely made up of inexperienced volunteers from the new armies and the PALS battalions, walked slowly across no man's land. They were heavily burdened with equipment, fully expecting empty trenches, but instead they were met by a storm of completely intact German machine gun fire. As Butchin notes, the ordered lines simply melted away. It was an absolute slaughter. Section 4. Why did the attack fail? So, a huge question here. How could 1.5 million shells fail to clear the way? Well, if you look at the British expectation versus the grim reality, the gap is just glaring. See, the British relied heavily on shrapnel shells, these scattered lead balls everywhere, which, sure, are deadly against troops out in the open, but they were practically useless at cutting thick, tangled barbed wire. Plus, they severely lacked high-explosive shells. Because of that, the bombardment totally failed to penetrate the deep, reinforced concrete dugouts where the Germans were hiding. The Germans simply waited out the storm underground, and the minute the barrage lifted, they rushed right back up to man their machine guns. Add to that a whole domino effect of catastrophic tactical failures. The British artillery utilized something called a creeping barrage, basically a moving curtain of artillery fire meant to stay just ahead of the advancing troops to give them cover. But the plan was way too rigid. The barrage moved too fast, outpacing the heavily laden infantry and leaving them totally exposed. Furthermore, once the troops went over the top, commanders lost all control. Relying on super vulnerable telephone lines and human runners meant the generals sitting in the rear had no clue what was actually happening on the ground. It made the battle plans terrifyingly inflexible. Section 5. Tanks and New Tactics. As you trace the timeline of this battle, you can see how an operation that was meant to last maybe a few days dragged into months of bitter, grinding attritional warfare through the summer. Both sides quickly realized the old ways just weren't working anymore. To break the deadlock of this relentless trench combat, the British introduced a brand new, frankly terrifying weapon to the battlefield on September 15th at Flers-Courcelette. Yep, this was the debut of the tank. Now, it wasn't the silver bullet they hoped for right out of the gate. Of the 49 Mark I tanks deployed, only 31 even managed to cross the German lines. They were incredibly slow, huge targets for direct artillery hits, and they suffered frequent mechanical breakdowns. But, and this is a big but, they achieved total psychological surprise. They could just roll right over the uncut barbed wire and straddle enemy trenches. Despite all those early technical flaws, the potential was obvious, and it actually prompted the British High Command to order 1,000 more. Section 6. The True Cost and Lessons. By November, the rapidly deteriorating autumn weather turned the entire battlefield into a literal sea of mud, which finally forced this horrific campaign to wind down. Take a second to really absorb this grim balance sheet of attrition. Over 620,000 Allied casualties, up to 600,000 Central Powers casualties. And what was the territorial gain for over 1 million men killed or wounded? Approximately 6 miles. 6 miles. It took 4.5 months to achieve what were originally supposed to be first-day objectives. It's just a profound illustration of the massive defensive advantage in trench warfare. However, historians point out that the legacy of the Somme is far more complex than just a simple failure. This brutal industrial warfare fundamentally weakened the German army. It proved, without a doubt, that the British could sustain massive continental warfare. The relentless pressure actually forced the Germans to abandon much of their high ground and retreat to a shortened, heavily fortified position known as the Hindenburg Line. It also forced them to completely change their defensive tactics to something called an elastic defense, basically absorbing attacks rather than rigidly holding on to every single inch of the front line. Many argue the Somme laid the bloody foundation that made the eventual 1918 victory possible. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider today. Based on everything we've just unpacked, the incredible gap between those grand plans and the gruesome reality, the terrible tactical failures, and the massive strategic shifts, how do you ultimately judge this? Was the Battle of the Somme just a futile slaughter orchestrated by out-of-touch commanders? Or was it a tragic but entirely necessary crucible of modern industrial warfare, where the brutal lessons required to win the war were finally learned? Let that sink in for a bit. Thanks so much for exploring this incredibly complex piece of history with me today in our Explainer. Catch you next time.